All right. Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to Blazor Stability Testing Tools for Bulletproof Applications. My name is Ed Charbonneau, and over the next hour, we're going to talk about testing Blazor applications from end to end. We're going to talk about unit testing and integration testing, automated testing, all the above. A lot of you are probably starting to build your first Blazor applications. Maybe you've built some already, but you're looking out at that Blazor landscape, wondering how testing fits into all of the types of applications that you're building at all the various stages of what you're building. Let's start off by talking a little bit about why I believe that Blazor is just inherently testable. So one of the things that makes Blazor testable is the fact that you have one language full stack. We've got C# for the entire front end and back end of the framework. So not only is our UI code built with .NET, but our unit tests are built with .NET. We don't have a JavaScript front end like we typically would in a web application, so we can use the same testing tools across the entire stack. So that's always benefit there. Components in .NET are just .NET classes. So again, we can use that same tooling, same language across the entire platform, and we can test our applications end to end with the same tooling. And we have Visual Studio integration for all of those tools as well. So we're never leaving Visual Studio. We're never leaving the language. We're writing .NET all over the front end, back end, any kind of shared logic, and all of our testing as well. And all the testing I'm about to talk about here covers the entire scope of the application. So we can write unit tests with C#, we can write integration tests, and we can even write automated system tests. So if we look at the stack that we're using with all of these testing platforms, we have various tools that we can use, and I'm going to talk about some of these today. xUnit and bUnit are excellent tools that we can use to do unit tests and integration tests with the front end of our application and shared logic. And I'll show you exactly where all these fit in just a moment. When it comes to system tests, we have some choices as well. A lot of people like to use Selenium. I work for Progress Telerik. And at Progress, we have quite a few applications that are tools that we're looking at integrating very tightly with this testing methodology. So if you're using xUnit and bUnit, we have a mocking framework that's free called JustMock. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but that tightly integrates with xUnit and bUnit tests. We have Telerik UI for Blazor, which is a front-end set of UI components, and those are testable with xUnit and bUnit and using JustMock. And they're also tightly integrated with our automated test system called Test Studio. So you've got this full set of tools that's really tightly integrated, not only throughout the .NET stack, but throughout the testing stack as well. So it's really interesting to see how this all plays out, and hopefully you'll learn something about it this morning. Let's talk a little bit about unit testing in general. So unit testing is very beneficial to us in Blazor applications and in just pretty much any type of C# application or just software development in general, because we get this nice red-green refactor cycle that I like very much. We're talking about like test-driven development, the ability to refactor without with confidence to know that you're not breaking something in your application. It lets you iterate very quickly through building portions of your application because you're focused on a small segment of your app and you're iterating on that piece very quickly. So in a Blazor application, we have this unit testing capability across any type of shared class library, any kind of shared application logic, anything that's shared in Blazor components that is not tied directly to the UI itself. And this is kind of unique with Blazor, again, because we're not using JavaScript directly. We're using C# on the front end and running .NET in the browser. So we're able to use xUnit tests to test that shared component logic. And if you're not familiar with the xUnit, just give you a brief overview of what a test in xUnit looks like. In xUnit, we're able to describe a fact, and this is our test. This fact attribute here is used to decorate the test and let the test runner know how to discover the test, identify the test. We can even set nice display names to describe our tests very well. Then we arrange what we're going to test. We create the unit under test. We act on that unit under test to do some sort of action exercise that class, and then we assert that some state in that that object is true. So that's the general idea of how a basic unit test works. And then we're going to move on here to talk about bUnit in just a moment. First, I want to pull up my application that I have running, and I have this open in Visual Studio, and I just want to take a quick look at what an application with unit tests and all of these other tests we're about to talk about in .NET looks like. So I'm going to zoom in here. Hopefully this comes through on the projection well, but I have a Visual Studio project here, and in my solution, I have several projects. So I have a Blazor application. That Blazor application has a client project, a server project, and a shared project. So I'm able to share code from my shared project into these other projects because, again, we're .NET full stack. I also have a test folder up here that has several test projects in it. So let me go ahead and open that up. And inside of my test project, you'll see that I have some end-to-end tests. I have some integration tests. I have unit tests. I have those unit tests that we were just talking about. And in this application, I've got some email validators. So one thing that's important to remember, again, we have full stack.NET, so we can test validation that we're performing on the front end in our UI components. And we can also use that same validation on the server to test things that are going in and out of our database, etc., because it's C# full stack. So in here, I've got some email validators that are being tested, and those are xUnit tests that are running and passing. So you can see here that I've got a passing symbol. So these are all good tests, and they're all successful so far. There's also an interesting method of writing tests here where instead of writing a fact, we're writing what's called a theory. And a theory basically runs multiple unit tests against some data-driven part of our unit under test. So we have some inline data that we're going to feed into our test. We can pass that data in as a parameter, and we can exercise this class with multiple sets of data to ensure that it's running properly. So I've got a couple sets of tests that are running with that type of a theory as well. And if I pull my test runner back up, you can see some of these tests running. Some are passing, some are failing. The unit tests here, the individual facts you can see are running and passing those email validators here. And then there's the theories running all of those multiple points of data to make sure that each aspect of that unit test passes. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about Blazor and how these unit tests fit into a Blazor project. So with Blazor, you can add some tooling to your application called bUnit. Now, bUnit is a library that was developed by a friend and Microsoft MVP. His name is Eagle Hansen. This is a free NuGet package that you can pull into your project, and it's an open source project that you can find at GitHub and contribute to. So bUnit is just a little bit different from the, has a little bit different of a solution than xUnit. It works with xUnit and other test libraries, but it's specifically to test components that are built for Blazor, things that render markup. So we can write C# or Razor syntax with these bUnit tests. It has a semantic HTML comparer built in. So when we're rendering our components, what this HTML semantic comparison will do is it will test the output of our rendered component, but it won't test things like white space and things that don't matter to a browser when it's rendering HTML. So if there are CSS classes that are out of order, those things don't matter to the rendered component in the browser. It will still look and act the same in code and display the same in the browser. So the semantic comparer won't consider those things like a basic string comparison would. So this is a very nice way to test that output HTML and make sure that it is acceptable for the browser. Another thing that's nice here is we can interact and trigger events on our components. So we can click buttons and do UI behaviors and things automatically. So this is a nice feature as well. Now, one thing that I like about using these type of unit tests to test components in Blazor is that I get that red-green refactor type of a cycle, that test-driven development cycle with component logic. If you're building Blazor applications already, then you might have noticed there's no instant feedback from Blazor. You have to rerun your application basically to see any changes that you've made in your components. And this type of a workflow can slow you down a little bit. In other web frameworks, we see hot module reloading, and sometimes when you're building components, they're re-rendering in the browser immediately. We're not quite there yet with Blazor, and this will give you that type of experience. It'll also give you tests that you can fall back on and see when they're passing and failing versus having to open a browser and visually and manually inspect things. And we'll take a look at how this this workflow plays out in just a moment. Let's talk a little bit about the structure of a bUnit test really quick first. So a bUnit test is essentially the same as an xUnit test, but we've got some wrappers around different parts of building a test to help us with components specifically. So again, you'll see a fact and a description, but inside of a bUnit test, we have the capability to render components. So we have a Blazor context that we're working inside of, and we can tell it to render, for example, here an alert component, and that will give us our component under test. And then we can tell bUnit that we expect that component to have this markup. So we're going to render what looks like an alert banner with a close button inside, and then we can test that and see if the markup matches, the rendered markup matches the expected markup that we gave the unit test. So now we can validate that is rendering the correct markup without loading the browser at all. So let's take a look at a demo of using bUnit. So when I pulled this project up earlier, you can see that I have many failing unit tests here. So we're going to go ahead and fix all of these today. And the first thing I want to do is look at a unit test that I have failing that is called alert test. And I have that passing test as well that I just showed in the slides. So we'll go ahead and look at the passing test first. And again, these are just xUnit tests. You can use other test frameworks here, but xUnit's one of my favorites, and it's a popular test library for the .NET community. And here's where I'm using bUnit. So first of all, I have a test context that I've inherited on my base class. And I have the bUnit libraries installed here. You can see using statement up at the top. And with bUnit, I'm able to create a rendered component. So I'm going to render an alert box. To show you what that alert box looks like in the application, I'll just go ahead and pull up a running instance of the Blazor app, and we'll zoom in a little bit here. This is my alert box that I'm testing the component logic for. And right now it's showing a red alert box, and I'm clicking here and I can't close my alert box. So there's definitely some development that needs to be completed on that alert box. So we can tell right now by this green checkbox that it initially renders correctly, but it isn't dismissible. My alert is dismissible. Unit test is failing. And also my alert theme info is failing. So I'd like this alert box to be able to change themes to from a red theme to an information theme, which is blue. And for some reason that's failing. So if I look at my unit test here, this will give me some clues as to what's happening in that component and why it's failing. So on my alert is dismissible test, bUnit is telling me, pardon me while there we go. bUnit's telling me that there is an exception and my HTML comparison has failed. And it expects a button element that's missing and a div element that's missing. And my actual markup is essentially my initial rendered HTML, and when the button to close that that element is clicked, it should have an expected output of an open button. So I've got this HTML when I'm expecting this HTML. So there's definitely something wrong with that component. It's not rendering the toggled state of that button. So let's go look at the button or the alert component in the application here. If I open up my alert component, this is a common mistake that I make all the time. Is sometimes I use the reversed logic for something. So when I click on my button, it's supposed to hide, and it's not toggling the state here. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this, and then we can go back and rerun that test and see if it toggles the HTML in our button. So we have this is hidden flag that's not being flipped to make that markup change. And now we've fixed that. So we can go back to our unit test and we can rerun that individual test. And then we should get a passing test here. And these unit tests tend to run pretty quickly. I am streaming here, so the machine is under a little bit of load, but you can see that it didn't take too long, and we've fixed that alert box. So if I were to go back to my application of the browser, we'll go ahead and refresh this. Where I couldn't dismiss this box before, I should be able to click on it, and you can see that it collapses down, and I can toggle that back and forth now. So that is one basic unit test that we can do with bUnit, and in that test, we're comparing an entire block of markup, and you saw me do this in the previous test as well. Now, this isn't the only type of test that we can do with bUnit. There's many types of tests that we can do with bUnit. One of the things that we can do is instead of testing an entire block of HTML, we can focus in on certain aspects of a piece of markup. For example, we can test to see if a CSS class is present, and that's what we're doing in the next test. So again, if we look at our alert box here, I have the ability to change this from red to blue using some parameters on that component. If we look at the component, you can see I have a parameter here called isInfo, and that parameter toggles whether that's an information alert or it's a danger alert. And right now, if I set that isInfo, it doesn't have any effect on the output of that component, and we could see that in our failing unit test here. So the alert has an info theme is failing, and in this comparison, instead of comparing all of the HTML, I'm only looking at a CSS class that's been applied to that markup. So in this test, I'm expecting the CSS class to be alert-info, and you can see it's even giving me the exact position here as to where that failure has occurred, where the actual output should be alert danger. Sorry, the expected is info, the actual is danger. So just that portion of the CSS class there is failing, and it's even pointing out with arrows here exactly where that word is incorrect in that unit test. So if we look at our unit test, we're going to render that alert component, and we're going to set its parameters when it's rendered, and we're going to set isInfo to true. Then we're going to tell bUnit that the expected CSS class is alert-info, and then we'll go ahead and find that component, or sorry, find the markup in that rendered component. So we'll go ahead and get the outer div, and then we'll select the class attribute from that div element, and then we will do an assert equal to check and see if the actual CSS matches what we expected. And again, this is failing, so let's go back to our alert box and fix the problem. Now to help fit all of this testing stuff into an hour session, I've coded this up already, but the problem was that I put a static set of strings up here where the class is being displayed. And what I actually needed was a variable that I was missing. So I was missing some data binding here. So I forgot to bring my data binding up into that CSS class and properly toggle that class element there, or attribute. So Visual Studio likes to hang on me from time to time, again, especially when I'm doing these streams. So that's going to spin for just a moment. And while Visual Studio recovers, let's see if I can get the presentation back up here. Now it's got my whole machine hung. So bear with me for a minute while my machine figures out why Visual Studio is not happy. It will recover in a second. This is something I've run into a few times. Something to do with my installation. I don't know, maybe you guys have had this happen to you as well, but we should see it restart itself here in just a moment. There we go. All right, it recovered, it's back. So I wanted to go back, apologize for that, by the way. Let's go back to our test runner. And we'll rerun that test that is testing whether we can set an info theme on that box. And you can see that that whole set of tests now is passing and it has lit up. And I never had to reload the browser at all to do that unit test and check it. So let's go ahead and go back. We'll refresh the page here. It's still red here because I believe in my index page, I haven't set that specifically. And this is the part that would be very manual. If you're going back and forth in editing these values to do manual unit tests, it can get quite slow of a development process. So I'm going to toggle isInfo here and set this to true. And we can see that this piece of markup here is now blue. So we've fixed that unit test as well. So that's just a little bit of what bUnit can do. We can do other types of testing as well with bUnit. We can do some more tightly integrated tests with bUnit. So I showed you how we can do some parameters. We can also test things like cascading values. We can inject services into components using bUnit. We can also bring in mocking libraries and mock some of those injected services. We can inject things like the JavaScript runtime and mock its behavior, because in these unit tests we don't have a browser, so we don't technically have JavaScript, so we can mock that out. We can mock authentication and authorization as well. And I like to use Telerik JustMock. Again, this is another free tool. Everything I've shown you so far is all free software that you can get. xUnit, bUnit, JustMock. You can find all of those things for free. Telerik JustMock and mocking, they're replacement objects that simulate real ones. So what this allows us to do is isolate parts of our code and just focus really tightly on what's being tested. And this is really easier to see in an example than it is to describe. So let's take a look at what we have here. This is what a typical mock with Telerik JustMock looks like. For example, here I have an iData service. Now, if you've ever done testing before, you might be familiar with a fake. So in the situation where you'd have a fake, what I'd have to do is create an entire implementation of an iData service myself. So I'd have to new up a class and have all the functionality there to satisfy an iData service. The benefit of having a mock is we're going to let the framework take care of this for us. So I don't have to create any type of fake data service or any type of concrete implementation of it. All I do is tell JustMock to mock.create, and then I pass it the interface that I would like it to mock. JustMock will give me back that mock data service. Once I have that mock data service, if there is a specific property or method on that mock instance that I would like to take control of and have some sort of defined output for, I can say mock data service, or sorry, mock.arrange, and I can arrange that mock to return a specific output when that method is called. So instead of going out and making an HTTP request or maybe hitting a database, this mock data service is just going to return a known set of strings back to me. So this mock is a helpful tool to isolate these tests down and make sure that we're testing the component logic and not running into errors and things related to HTTP traffic or databases, and what the, we don't have to set up test databases and have production databases and worry about those scenarios while we're creating our unit tests. So let's go back to our test runner and see what we have as far as failing tests, because there are some tests in here that we can fix with mocking and bUnit. So we have a form on our page. Let's take a quick look and have a visual here. We have a form that has a view model attached to it. It has an initial birth date. There's first name, last name. There's also these region boxes. And right now, the development on these is incomplete, and that's why our unit tests are failing. What we want to do is make sure that when our component is correctly working, that we load this region box with data, and when we select an item from it, it will select, or sorry, it will populate or cascade into the drop-down box below. We also want to select a default value on each of these, so the user has at least a default value there. So if I go back to my test explorer, you can see where I've started writing these tests, and we'll look at a passing test here very quickly first. So what's nice about this whole scenario here is I can initialize this form, and just using xUnit alone, I can initialize the form and I can check that some of the default values are there, because this is just a .NET class. This is just a plain class object here. And you can see I'm setting a default date here at the top, and that unit test verifies that when that form view model is created, that the default date range is selected. And we can check that really quickly, and it passes. So the next thing we want to do is we want to populate that region dropdown. And when we load the form, we want to check and see that the region's first item is selected on initialization. So we have a drop-down box. We want the first item in the data set that comes to that drop-down box to be selected. Right now that test is failing. So let's take a look at why that test is failing. So right now there is a lot of output from the failure on the screen here. So we need to kind of look at the exception and see what's going on. So it says cannot provide a value for property data service on type. And it gives us the type of that index page. And it says there is no registered service. There's no registered service for the type iData service. When we see this in a .NET application, when we're in any typical .NET app and we see there is no registered service for this keyword here, or this key phrase, there is no registered service for type. In any .NET application, you can see this error. And what this means is that you have not registered with dependency injection a way for this type to be resolved through dependency injection. Now, in a typical Blazor app, you would find this in program.cs. And you can see that in our program.cs, we are registering an iData service to inject an HTTP-based data service into the application. Now, in our unit test, we're resolving against iData service in a scope that is outside of the running application. Again, we're trying to focus in on the components themselves. We don't want to test the entire application. We just want to test that component. So we have to set up our environment in that unit test to do that dependency injection, similar to the way we would in our full .NET application. So if I scroll up a little bit from this section here where our unit test is described, again, I have this render component. We need to tell bUnit how to create that iData service. So I've got a method up here. I'm going to just on comment. Again, just trying to save a little bit of time here instead of trying to write all this code by hand. But in this section, I have services that are required for that component to load. So I don't want to inject that entire HTTP data service and try to do HTTP traffic. Then I might get errors if the server's down, or I forgot to run that portion of the application, etc. Or maybe I don't have a database available. So I'm going to use JustMock here, and I'm going to mock an iData service, and then I'm going to arrange that when I call the get regions method on that iData service, that it gives me back a known set of strings. And then I also have a get teams by region function here that will take any type of input, and we're going to go ahead and echo some of that input back out and give some results for the get teams by region function of that iData service as well. Once we have our mocks built, we can inject those services into bUnit, into the running test context. So I have my mock data service here, and I'm also using the Telerik UI components that I talked about briefly at the beginning. I'm using those on the page, and I can inject their services too. So the Telerik UI libraries are compatible with this bUnit library, so I can fully unit test everything. So we have the ability to inject that service now. Let's go back and rerun all of our tests for this block here. Actually, I just reran all the tests for the entire project, so it might take just a quick second to run all of those. And we're still seeing an error on that unit test. So let's see what we have here. And it says value cannot be null. So we have some errors in our logic that we have to go fix. So let's go back over to our application code and take a look at the index page again. And on that index page, we have our two Telerik drop-down lists that you saw on the form. And on our page initialization, we're not loading any data yet. So we're not exercising that data service at all. So we'll come in here and we will tell our data model to go ahead and get the data service and call get regions on our data service. And then we will invoke the selected region changed, and we'll set the default value, we'll set the default value on the region. We'll exercise the selected regions functionality right there, which we're not handling that yet. So let's go back and rerun our test and see if we've fixed that unit test, and we'll still have a couple more that we need to look at here. So we'll let that one run, and hopefully, let's see, we still have a failure here. This one is looking at the first item, and it expected it to be AA, but it is actually returning a null. And I think I'm actually missing the piece of code here that was supposed to be here, and it should have been. Here we go. This is what we should have had here. So we want to set the selected region in our code, so we can go back and test this one more time, and it should pass. So we're setting the model value here in our page component, and that should resolve this unit test. So this gives us that nice unit testing red-green refactor type workflow or test-driven development workflow. And usually you don't have the code nicely commented for you like I do here, but hopefully this gives you the idea of how the process works. And then again, we would have another failure, a very similar one where the model is not set again. So we expected a value, and the actual value is null. So we can see that we're forgetting to set some data on our form again, or we haven't written that part of our code yet. So we'll go back out to a service, select some more data, go to our model, and set the selected initial value for that drop-down box. And we can do more than set the initial values as well, and we could take a look at that in just a second. Let's go ahead and rerun this block of tests. I believe they all should pass now, and they do. So let's go look at what all of those tests are doing individually. So we've tested our model to see if it initializes correctly. We're loading the regions, and we have this, let's go back and refresh this really quick so you can get a visual of what's being tested here. So now when our page loads, you can see we have default values selected. So that was one of our tests that passed. But when I select these items, this selected region will cascade down into the team and set the team names based on what the region is. So you can see right now it's BR. If I grab AE, now all my teams end in AE. So it's a cascading dropdown. These are very common in any UI that we might be building. So the way these tests are working is we're going to load that index page, and that will kick off some of those data services and things and select the default item. Now, I'm actually exercising on this test. Let's see, let me make sure I have the right one. Yeah, this is the one here. So I'm testing that cascading functionality here. I'm getting my index page. I'm rendering that index component, which is the entire page with all of the components on it. So I'm going to go with my bUnit code here, and I'm going to say on my component under test, find the Telerik dropdown list. And on that Telerik dropdown list, invoke the method on it, invoke the value changed method. So I'm going to tell the dropdown list that the value changed, and I'm going to give it a value to change that dropdown to. So I'm simulating grabbing an item off that dropdown list. So in my unit test, I'm telling it to select an item, and then I'm going to go into the team dropdown, the model that backs that selected value, and check and see if that cascading effect has taken place. So I'll go back and assert that the expected value is set to or is equal to the value that was set on the instance's model on the team's property. So now I can make sure that I have that cascading behavior happening in my component. So we've got kind of a really deep integration test happening now in these unit tests. So let's talk about the next phase of testing. So we've got just a few minutes left. I want to talk about automated system testing for just a minute. This lets us test a completely integrated system. We can test something that is on a development server. We can also test an application that is fully running in the production environment as well. So we can do end-to-end testing, and we can automate this entire process. Telerik Test Studio is what I'm going to use for this portion today. Selenium is an alternative, but I think you'll find Test Studio quite powerful, and there are some tools that we have that allow you to build these automated tests without knowing how to do automated testing. Is quite incredible. It's something that I've used in production professionally, but I'm also starting to learn more about as we build more features into this tool. I'm learning about it because we're so tightly integrated into Blazor, which is the product I'm focused on, that it's gotten my interest again. So we can do all sorts of testing, API testing, load testing, etc. But what is really cool here is this test recorder I'm about to show you, because you don't have to know how to make automated tests. You just have to know how to point and click at a screen. So this is pretty cool stuff, and it's extremely tightly integrated with the Telerik UI for Blazor UI components. And I'll show you how that works. We'll do this live here in the browser. But the idea is that I can go into my running application and I can highlight elements, and Test Studio will not only identify basic HTML elements, even competitors' UI components, but if you're using Telerik UI components, you get even more intuitive test integration. So the Test Studio will identify the Telerik UI components and light up all of the properties that are available via code on the screen here for you to inspect and validate right in the browser. So let's take a look at the test recorder, because a live demonstration of it does it way more justice than some slides do. So in my test project, I'm going to stay in Visual Studio. There is a standalone test recorder as well, so you don't have to have a Visual Studio license if you have a member of your team that is QA and they're not a Visual Studio user. We have a completely standalone tool as well. I'm in Visual Studio, so I'm going to go ahead and open my unit test, or my automated test here. And I'm wondering if when Visual Studio crashed earlier, if it has taken out, there we go. I was gonna say it may have taken out my UI. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show my running application again. So this is just my running app. I'm gonna go ahead and close this window. I just want to make sure that my server was running. So I'm running without debugging right now. I could run this same test scenario against a production application as long as I have a URL. Matter of fact, I better capture this URL here. So I'm on localhost. I'm going to go ahead and get that address off the address bar. And I'm going to click on this record button up at the top of the screen. So you can see there's a record button here. I'm going to record a functional test, an automated test right now. So I'm going to hit the record button. I'm going to paste in the URL of my running application, and I'm going to hit record. Now, the test environment is just my browser. It's going to pull it up, and you'll see I have this test recorder bar that has appeared on screen with me. And using this, just like the F12 developer tools in my browser, I can click on this button, and I can inspect various parts of my application. So I can test and see if my alert box is here. So I can say that verify that element is visible. We'll go ahead and pause that recording first, or the inspection tool for a moment. We'll click on the close button, and then I can go back in here, and then I can validate that after I have clicked that this element is visible. And this recorder is recording all of my interactions with my form here. So I can come in and it will recognize this Telerik drop-down list. And I can verify that the selected text is AE on that region. I can also change this drop-down box, and we will change it to BN, and then we can go ahead and inspect our team here. And we can validate that has changed. We can also do things like submit the form. And we can validate that our pop-up window has appeared. So we can validate that the window is not minimized, or it's maximized, or the title is thank you, because it's picking up the Telerik UI components. It's giving me those properties because it knows how to discover them. And if these are just standard HTML tags, we have that information as well. So you can see I have a paragraph tag that's come up here, and I can validate that the text in that paragraph tag is displayed. So I'll go ahead and pause this recorder, and then we'll go ahead and close our window, and you can see that Test Studio has recorded all of those interactions on our form here. And we have a verification process here where we're checking things like the exact text of a drop-down box reads out to a specific value. Our confirmation window was displayed, and the paragraph tag contains the text, thank you, we've received your information, an email will be provided. All of that is in there. and we have the ability to go in and modify all of these test steps as well. So if something changes, we can go in and change those messages and not have to rebuild the entire test from scratch. So let's go ahead here, and I'm going to click execute on this automated test now, and I've got my hands off the keyboard. This is Test Studio is going to open up this browser instance, and it will run through all of those unit tests that you saw me click through and validate that the outputs are what we recorded. So let's see what we've got here. It's I think we're going to get a failing test for some reason, but there's probably something in here that just needs to be tweaked a little bit. So it says it was unable to find a button at a certain step. We can, not sure why it wasn't able to find and click that button, but we could try rerunning that test again. Sometimes it's just a little bit of a browser latency issue here, which you can totally modify in SPA applications. Sometimes there's a delay of services and things that are happening. Looks like it's clicking the button, but there's something that happened afterwards that it doesn't like. Let's see if we can just, maybe it's an erroneous step that we don't need. We'll remove that. With these SPA or single page applications, sometimes there are AJAX calls happening or window refreshes that need to take place. Sometimes there's a little latency involved in some of the UI components. You can account for those as well. So there are await behaviors that can be added to these steps too. So if certain process might take a little bit longer sometimes than others, you can accommodate for those things and set various timeouts. It's a very flexible tool. And then all of the steps that are in these tests are C#. So all of the tests are written in C# as well. So again, I told you we wouldn't leave .NET the entire time. Telerik Test Studio, all of the code for those unit tests, again, C#. So we could come in here and add custom methods. We could use dependency injection and xUnit and all of those things inside of a test, Telerik Test Studio test. We can even make calls to JavaScript in here if we need to. That is something that you may need from time to time. So it's very intuitive to do these things in Test Studio. In fact, I had a test that I was working on for a personal project the other day where I had to call out to JavaScript and do some resizing of the browser dynamically. I was able to do that in just one line of code here, right in C#. Call out to JavaScript, tell it to resize the browser, and my tests were done and ready to be automated. So with all of those things, we can fully unit test an application. We can test integration points between not only services, not only external services, but we can integrate, do integration tests between multiple components. You saw we did some integration tests between two different drop-down components on a form that were integrated with a view model, and they mocked a service. And then we had Test Studio running an automated test against that same form and exercising those drop-downs with a live HTTP connection. So we have so many ways that we can tackle these unit tests with Blazor. Blazor's been pretty amazing to work with over the last couple of years for me, and I just keep finding new ways to be productive and new ways to make sure that applications can be written with these integrity points in mind. So with that said, I have some resources here up on the screen. xUnit is easy to find these days. It's baked into Visual Studio, but you can find out more at xUnit.net. bUnit, again, the gentleman that makes that, Eagle Hansen, very talented community member. So bUnit.eaglehansen.com is where you'll find bUnit. You can also find it on NuGet. Both of these, if you go on NuGet.com and just search bUnit or xUnit, you'll find those packages up there. Please visit Telerik.com. We have a lot of amazing tools for Blazor. I got to show you 3 of them today. One of those tools is free. JustMock is free. Telerik, Test Studio, and Telerik UI for Blazor are commercial products. Just for a little disclaimer there. You can always find me on Twitter at Ed Charbonneau, and I wrote an article that outlines all of this information, and there's various links in there and examples like the ones I gave you today. You can find that article here at this bit.ly link, so grab a screenshot of that and go visit the article, and you have kind of a transcript of what you saw today. Thank you for joining my session. I've got 5 minutes left. I will take questions if I have questions in chat here. And I'm not seeing any questions. If you have those, post those now. Otherwise, I'll assume this is a job well done and you have all the information you need. All right, so not a very talkative crowd this afternoon. No questions coming in. Hopefully you all enjoyed the session, and I think it's about, we've got a global audience, so for folks that are in the home region of CodeGen, enjoy your afternoon and your lunch. For folks here in my time zone, is early in the morning still. So enjoy breakfast and have a great day.